Greetings and welcome to Mr. Campbell's Global 9 class. We're in Unit 3.2, Rise of the West, Part C, A Time of Turmoil, the Protestant Reformation, and Nationhood. Our main self-test questions we want to consider here: what were the causes of the Protestant Reformation? What were the effects of the Protestant Reformation? What impact did religious conflicts have in Western Europe? And what was the Counter-Reformation? This is a pretty deep unit. There's a lot of enduring issues here. The Protestant Reformation is certainly a key turning point in history. You can honestly expect a turning point CRQ on this sometime in the future or sometime this year. Just a lot, chock full of enduring issues, chock full of main concepts, main ideas, a lot of impacts across Western Europe. Don't forget, Europe is not a single country. It is a continent composed of many different kingdoms and principalities at this time. So, causes of the Reformation. There are both secular or non-religious issues that deal with politics and economics and sociology, as well as religious issues, arguments of actual religious doctrine in the Christian church, arguments of actual faith. But first, we're going to go over these secular or non-religious issues, these causes of the Reformation. So the Renaissance had happened and had spread from Italy to pretty much the rest of Europe, flowing northward out of Italy through trade routes and things like that. And these Renaissance secular ideas of humanism, or focusing on the world itself, your impact on the world, one's individual's place in the world, and the concept of bettering a single human. And this focus on the individual and reason caused people to begin to question the church's authority. And this isn't like everyone in Europe. We're talking about a relatively small group of educated individuals who could read and write. They're reading the Bible and they're not seeing things in the Bible that the church is saying is true, or they're seeing different arguments in the Bible than that which the church was making. And others wanted to return to a simpler faith, that they felt that the church had become kind of too ostentatious, that they had become too driven by their own rituals and things like that. They wanted to go back to a simpler, more maybe original form of Christianity than that of the Roman Catholic Church, the dominant religious institution in Western Europe. Some European monarchs, kings and queens, and princes, remember they also can control smaller kingdoms or principalities, they resented the church's attempts to control them. Remember, the church had tried to and had successfully kind of exerted power over these monarchs, and they backed reformers in order to gain power. Some of them were also angered about how wealthy the church was and how much land the church owned, that this was land that could not be taxed. And you got to remember, kings couldn't tax the church, but the church itself did tax people and was very, very wealthy. So these European monarchs, these princes, will see reformers or people trying to change the church or go against the church as an opportunity to kind of have like a hungry hippo's power grab and maybe claim land or wealth or just overall centralization of their control of the people for themselves. Another huge secular issue was the invention of Johannes Gutenberg's printing press. This spread ideas. This allowed the Bible to be produced much more cheaply and in much greater numbers. It spread writings, anti-church writings or critical writings of the church. And more Europeans began to read and began to form their own ideas about religion and about Christianity. Some religious and secular issues kind of combined were kind of a weakening or a series of events that weakened the power and the prestige of the Roman Catholic Church. One of these we've talked about before, the Western Schism from 1378 to 1417 CE. This is the idea that you had this time period where there were multiple popes, that the Roman Catholic Church had elected one pope by Italian lords, and then another pope was elected by French lords. The French pope moved the seat of the church from Rome to a French city called Avignon. And basically, you had this power struggle over which pope is the right pope. And, to try and solve this, they elected a third pope, which didn't really solve anything at all. And the reality of this is it wasn't really about religious doctrine or religious arguments. The Western Schism was in many ways about power. Like the French kings, the French monarchs supported the Avignon papacy because that was in their homeland, France, and it would make France more powerful, and they could ally with the French Pope and gain more political, religious, and social power, where the Italians supported their pope, etc., etc. And Europeans across the continent had to pick which pope were they going to obey, which rules were going to obey. So Europeans kind of were divided along these lines of which pope to obey. And though eventually the Western Schism ends, and you go back to having one pope, and eventually the popes move back to Rome, the result is the power and the prestige and people's kind of faith in the office of the papacy was weakened. And again, not everyone across Europe, but certainly in educated circles and just kind of here and there, people were like, well, this doesn't seem right that these popes are arguing over who's pope. We're only supposed to have one of these guys. There were also a lot of criticisms leveled at the church, specifically focusing around the idea of corruption in the church. Now, I don't want to do an overgeneralization and say every single priest was a bad guy, every single monk was a bad guy, but there were powerful leaders in the church, including a pope or two, who many thought and many, quite frankly, saw and believed were very, very corrupt. Some of the clergy, especially upper level clergy like bishops and cardinals, the powerful people in the church, some of them were very concerned with worldly affairs, of amassing land, amassing political power and military power, amassing greater and greater wealth. Why are these people who are supposed to be humble and holy and righteous, why are they dressed in silk robes with gold necklaces and gold rings and living in mansions? That doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense if you, actually read the Bible, especially the New Testament and the acts and works of Jesus of Nazareth. He is not living in a mansion. He's not wearing silk. So why are these followers of Christ doing that? The church fees and tithes were deemed by many to be too expensive, that the church is getting wealthier and wealthier, and even in times of like famine or hardship, they're still expecting their 10%. They're still expecting their peasants to deliver food to the church. You had something called simony going on. Simony was the selling of church offices, specifically like high offices of bishoprics or cardinalships. And the church, in order to make money, would say, hey, do you want your second son or your third son to be powerful, even though they're not going to inherit land? Well, pay us a bunch of money and we'll make your son a bishop of a powerful city, and they'll have wealth and land and a military at their control. And if you're a noble or even a monarch, this is a good deal to ally yourself with the church, to pay a big chunk of money to get one of your relatives brought into the church in one of these powerful roles. But again, that's not in the Bible that you can do that. The Archmagus Simon is in the Bible as a bad guy. Like he's not. That's where we get the word simony from. Nepotism, that some members of the church promoted their own family using their religious power to validate wars or acts of violence, or just promoting people from within their family. You had some priests, not some monks too, and definitely some members of the bishops and the cardinals who broke their celibacy vows. In the Catholic Church, priests are not supposed to have relations with members of the opposite sex, and there were some bishops and cardinals and some of these powerful members that had not just wives or mistresses or visited prostitutes, and people knew this. Like, hey, that guy's going to a brothel. Isn't he a bishop? That doesn't seem right. And some were caught drinking, gambling, or otherwise acting un-Christ-like, un-priest-like. And a lot of people are like, well, that doesn't really seem right. One of the biggest examples of this is Pope Alexander VI, and he's pope from 1492 to 1503. He built huge, lavish palaces for himself and his family using church money. So again, this is money, if you read the Bible, this is money that's supposed to be spent to clothe and feed the poor, to provide medicine and care for the sick, to care for orphans and widows. And he's just building himself a brand new set of huge palatial mansions in Rome, with silk sheets and this and all the best fixings that you could have. He had numerous mistresses and numerous children with those mistresses. He supported his son, Caesar Borgia, who was a mercenary, so like a bloodthirsty, sword for hire. And he tried to build himself his own little kingdom in Italy, and he used the power of the church to do so. And so definitely kind of a very corrupt dude. And a lot of people were very angry about this. And some early reformers thought that the Bible should be the ultimate authority. Why are we even listening to the church at all? And this is kind of a big idea. I'd like you to star this one. That, people are like, well, why does the church get to interpret the Bible? Now that we have the Bible being able to be mass produced by this printing press, Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, and more people are reading it, they're like, well, we should only listen to the Bible. Like, that's the word of God, not what a pope says. We should only do what's in the Bible, nothing else. So these are all this kind of crisis of faith and causes of the Reformation. And then one of the things that really is the tipping point or leads to a tipping point is this one, indulgences. So start this one, this is a big deal. Okay, some reformers were against the sale of indulgences. These are pardons for sins that people paid for. So, the idea here is everyone sins. Like, you really, really can't live a perfect life. Everyone has some sins in the Christian church. And you're supposed to do penance and you're supposed to go to confession. And the church comes up with this scheme, basically, that you can pay for a piece of paper that takes away some of your time away from purgatory, or where you're cleansed of these sins upon dying. Removing or the removal of sin is known as remission of sin or absolution. And so effectively what these were is buying your place into heaven. That, now heaven is supposed to be open to the wealthiest people. And you even had like poor farmers and merchants trying to scrap together every dollar they had in order to pay for this remission of sin. You have this great letter. This is a kind of a mass or a speech given by one of the supporters of the indulgences, a Roman Catholic friar named Johann Tetzel. And he says, but with these confessional letters, these indulgences, you will be able at any time in life to obtain full indulgence for all penalties imposed upon you in all cases. Therefore, throughout your whole life, whenever you wish to make confession, you may receive some remission or forgiveness of sin, except in cases reserved to the Pope. And afterwards, at the hour of death, a full indulgence as to all penalties and sins, and your share of all spiritual blessings that exist in the church militant and all its members. And you had like a price list, like what sin did you commit? Well, that's 3 coppers. Oh, you committed this sin? That's 10 silver. And this made a lot of money for the church. People were scrapping together everything. And it wasn't just, buying indulgences for yourself. Some of these priests were basically traveling salesmen, and they'd be going to townspeople who they knew had money and be like, well, you know what? Your mother passed away a year ago, and that was very traumatic. And she was a great woman, but like all people sin. She could be suffering right now in purgatory or suffering right now in hell. But if you hand me over several $1,000s, I'll write you an indulgence for your mother. Isn't your mother worth a couple coins? Isn't your mother or your father or your grandma or whatever, aren't they worth money? You can't take money with you, but you can buy these people a place in heaven through buying forgiveness. And this is nowhere in the Bible that you can do this. So as people read the Bible, they're like, this seems super sus. This is pretty sketchtacular here. And they're not too happy about this, which leads us to kind of the moment that begins the Protestant Reformation. It all starts with a German monk named Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther isn't just like a normal monk. His father had become quite wealthy. His father had sent him to law school. He was supposed to be a lawyer, but he has kind of a crisis of faith and wants to ensure his place in heaven. So he becomes a monk. He goes to college to get degrees in theology, basically religious studies, and he eventually gets the equivalent of like a PhD in religious studies. He becomes a doctor. So he's a monk living a monastic life, but he also is a teacher at local universities. He also is a very brilliant mind. His early studies in legal aspects in law school give him an interesting insight into language. And he personally opposed the selling of indulgence. He's like, yeah, this isn't in the Bible. I've studied the Bible. It's kind of my thing. And I don't see this in here. And a huge turning point and the kind of historical circumstances of this Protestant Reformation is this anger over the selling of indulgences. And after hearing one of these speeches by one of these traveling priests selling these indulgences, he becomes very angry and upset. And he sits down and he writes the 95 Thesis, or a series of arguments criticizing indulgences. And October 31st, 1517, a huge turning point. You need to know that date. That's a huge deal. He nails these 95 theses to the church door of the Wittenberg church. This is like the main church in his city, which is a pretty main city, a big deal town and city in Germany. And this act begins the Protestant Reformation, this nailing of these arguments, these 95 theses, where everyone can read them. The church is a public building. Everyone can see these, and people take them and begin to copy them using the printing press. So a major turning point in European and world history. Europeans will begin to break away from the Catholic Church and form new Christian churches, new Protestant churches. And another reason it's a huge turning point is the religious unity of Europe. The idea that they're all bound together in one Catholic Church will be forever broken. So this is a huge, huge deal. You're going to take a look at the 95 Thesis in a guided reading or a document packet you're going to have. And you're probably going to see these or parts of them in CRQs. You're going to see parts of them maybe even in an enduring issue essay. This is a tremendous world-changing event. So what then are Martin Luther's ideas? Like, what did he say in the 95 Thesis? I'm not going to make you read all 95, but these are his big ideas, both in the 95 Thesis and in later writings. One of the biggest is salvation, reaching heaven, being quote-unquote saved, cannot be achieved through rituals and sacraments and buying indulgences, but through faith alone. In Latin, solo fide. Only your faith that God wants you to be saved. That is the only thing that matters. Your faith in Christianity, your faith in God, your faith in Jesus as the Redeemer of mankind. Not weird rituals, not anything else. He says all of the church's teachings should be based strictly on the Bible. Not what popes say, not what early Christian church writers say, but the Bible should be the penultimate jurisdiction over what it means to be a Christian. He says all people of faith are equal. Priests are not needed to interpret the Bible, and they do not have special powers. Remember, in Catholic Church, like priests can undergo these rituals like Mass and the sacraments and confession and can absolve you of sin. And he says, no. All Christians are equal. Priests don't have special magic, religious, healing, holy powers. They're just supposed to guide us in our faith, not actually take away sin. That can't be done. And he says the Bible needs to be written in the vernacular so all people can read it. Now, the vernacular is the language people know. So at this time in the Roman Catholic Church, all Bibles were published in Latin, the language of the church. Martin Luther was a German. He spoke German, but he also knew Latin as well because he had to be a doctor and a student of religion. But he's like, the Bible needs to be more available to people. So if he wrote the Bible in everyday language, German for German people, French for French people, English for English people, Italian for Italian people, Spanish for Spanish people, if we had these Bibles written in the people's language, all people could read the Bible and create their own personal relationship with God. They wouldn't need priests to tell them what the Bible says. They would know what the Bible says, and that would create greater faith, and that would allow more people to be saved in this concept of solo fide. So these are his main ideas here, outlined in this 95 Thesis. So obviously, the title of the slide, The Papacy Strikes Back. The church is not too happy with this. The Pope at the time, Leo X, who is thought by some to also be a very corrupt Pope, he excommunicated Luther. So he struck him from the church. Like, yeah, what you're saying is wrong. You are guilty of heresy. You're done. You're out of here. But the ideas are already spreading. They have been published by the printing press in many different towns, many different cities. These ideas are spreading like wildfire across the Germanic lands, and some reaching even other parts like France and northern Italy. And so the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, he says, all right, we're going to settle this, and we're going to settle this the right way. We got to stamp out these ideas, but we're going to do it legally. And he holds a religious council called the diet of Worms. And Worms is not like, hey, like we're gonna go look for earthworms and eat what fish eat. No, this is a city in Germany, so it's a big council. Diet's a fancy word for like a council or a meeting of important people, and there are. Charles V is there, so the actual Holy Roman Emperor is there. You have high-ranking cardinals. I think the Archbishop of Mainz, one of the main German cities, there. All these high-ranking members of the church, but also a lot of princes, a lot of nobles from Germany are there. There's tons of just highbrow people there. And this is a council, but it's really a trial of Martin Luther's ideas. And this council decides that his teachings, his ideas are false. And they declare him and his ideas excommunicado, forbidden basically, and they declare himself and anyone who follows his ideas heretics or wrong believers. This is known as the Edict of Worms, or the Law of Worms, which basically says, the ideas of Martin Luther are false, the 95 Theses are false, anyone who follows them is a heretic and can ostensibly be arrested by any authority. However, Martin Luther is allowed to speak at this trial, and it's a crowded, packed room. And his defense, his arguments, even though the council decides against him, the council knew what they were going to decide from day one. They weren't even really listening, truthfully. But other people in this room were. And his strong defense, his faith in his ideas, his eloquence, his excellence in speaking, it won a lot of Europeans and a lot of the German princes to his cause. And you have one of the most famous lines from his defense where they have a pile of his books and they're like, declare these wrong, declare your writings false, and you get off scot-free. Like you are an admired person in the church. You just declare that what you wrote was wrong, that you made a mistake, and you will be brought back into the church. Everything will be fine. We'll just sweep this under the rug. And he says, unless I am convinced by proof from the scriptures, from the Bible, or by plain and clear reason and arguments, I can and will not retract my statements. For it is neither safe nor wise to do anything against my conscience. Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. Amen. He's like, unless you guys provide me with actual arguments about why my 95 Theses are wrong, why we shouldn't base the church on the Bible, why priests have special powers, unless you can convince me through plain logical argument, right, an idea of the Renaissance, an idea of humanism, I have to stick to my guns on this. I have to go forward with this because this is now what my faith has directed me to do. He is declared a heretic, and he escapes into hiding. A very powerful German prince and lord basically is like, I like your ideas a lot, bro. Luther, you're going to come hang out at one of my castles. We're going to keep you hidden, and you're going to keep writing. And so he goes into hiding. He translates the Bible into German. It gets starting to be mass produced again by the printing press. And so his ideas are spreading even further. More German people, more princes are reading this. More even members of the church and monastic orders are reading this. And it starts a big hullabaloo. So, what are the effects of the Reformation? Well, very early on, because of Martin Luther's writings and because of his arguments, you see this new branch of Christianity form called Lutheranism, especially in Germany. Despite being declared heretics, Luther's ideas spread through the printing press and princes and priests who embraced his ideas. Most of these initially are in Germany, but eventually the Reformation does spread across Europe. So in Germany specifically, who are kind of like the first peoples who adopt Lutheranism and adopt his 95 Theses and ideas, priests begin to call themselves ministers, not priests, because they believe in Luther's argument that there can be no priests. They led services in the vernacular. Instead of giving mass and services in Latin, which a lot of common people didn't understand, they begin to speak to people in German and tell the stories of the Bible in German, which is wildly popular with many people. Because they're no longer priests, they no longer have to keep a vow of celibacy, and they begin to marry, women of their choosing. Martin Luther gets married, and they say no more indulgences, and even a lot of the sacraments and rituals like confession. They say we're not going to use these anymore. We can't find these in the Bible, therefore we do not acknowledge them. And so these followers of Martin Luther can no longer call themselves a member of the Catholic Church, but they begin to call themselves Protestants or Lutherans. And so this all of this leads to, as it spreads to other countries, a new form of Christianity, star that, called Protestantism, that spreads across Europe. And one of the big things about Protestants is they deny the authority of the Pope. They say nowhere in the Bible does it say there should be one person in charge of all of Christianity. We do not acknowledge that the Pope has the power to determine religious laws, to determine what is right and wrong about being a Christian. And we believe in only faith alone, solo fide. So huge branch. Now the religious unity of Europe is just shattered forever as these new Protestant forms of Christianity, protesting the authority of the Pope, protesting the practices of the Catholic Church, begin to pop up across Europe. Other effects of the Protestant Reformation. One of these is a series of peasant revolts in German-speaking principalities. These peasants kind of saw in the rejection of the Pope's authority or papal authority, a rejection of all authority. And so peasant revolts rejecting serfdom and feudalism popped up across Germany. And they're influenced by some of these early Protestant leaders, not Martin Luther himself. I want to be very clear here. And initially they have success because they kind of like surprise the nobility. They storm castles, they execute nobles, they execute knights. But eventually, after a couple surprise victories and surprise attacks, the aristocracy, princes, and knights band together in actual armies and they crush the peasant revolt. I mean, again, your average peasant doesn't really have battlefield training. They don't have like swords or armor. They're just wearing whatever they can get. They're like, hey, I've got a half of a door. I'll make it into a shield. Well, that's not the same as like a fully armored European knight. So these peasant revolts are crushed. And it's not helped that the fact that Martin Luther himself disapproved of these revolts. He was disgusted by the violence, by the execution of knights, by the execution of nobles, by the violation of noble women by these peasant hordes. And he actually writes a pamphlet against them saying, the right of lords and nobles to rule is enshrined in the Bible. Render unto Caesar what Caesar is due, which is a line from the New Testament. Other effects of the Protestant Reformation is a further splintering and the creation of all these new types of Protestantism. Like Lutheranism was the first of these Protestant religions of Christianity, but many others pop up as other reformers, other people with their own ideas of how to change the church and make Christianity better pop up. And one of the most famous of these is a guy named John Calvin. And he's another very educated religious leader, and he joins this Reformation, but he basically has his own ideas, and he begins a form of Christianity called Calvinism. He believes in a concept called predestination. He says since God is all-powerful and all-knowing, he's known since the beginning of time who's going to get into heaven and who doesn't, that's already predetermined. Like you can't act better, you can't be a better Christian and earn a place in heaven. God's already decided who's getting in and who's not because God's all powerful. And the few people who are going to make it are known as the elect. The elect are going to go to heaven. All others cannot be saved. Doesn't matter, how many orphans you clothe and how many widows you provide with food and stuff like that. The elect are going to go to heaven. Everyone else is not. And his Calvinist followers are asked to establish a government in this city called Geneva, Switzerland. And they create a theocracy there, a government by religion. And they outlawed all these things they thought were unchristian, like dancing, bright clothing, anything, happiness, singing, except for religious songs. And so while you would think this sounds terrible, it actually spreads to Germany, France, Holland, and England and Scotland as well, and eventually becomes a type of religion known as the Puritans. And you might remember the Puritans were kind of those original pilgrims who traveled to Massachusetts fleeing England, the pilgrims of the Thanksgiving story. They were a type of Calvinist known as Puritans. So again, the spread of this religion eventually even makes its way into the New World, into Massachusetts, into what would become the 13 colonies, though it doesn't necessarily become the dominant religion of the 13 colonies. As Protestantism spreads, it begins to splinter into a ton of different religions. We've already talked about Lutheranism, and there's Lutheranism there. We've already talked about Calvinism as well. But these ideas spread because, again, of the printing press and the increased trade and contact going on in Europe because of the commercial revolution and because of other changes. And Protestantism especially appealed to the middle class townspeople, right? The burghers, those who live in the town. Intellectuals, people who are educated, doctors, lawyers, merchants, things like that, and some princes and rulers, because these people could read. Generally, these middle class people could read and write, so they're the first people being able to read the Bible, read the writings of Martin Luther and others, and it appeals to them. They're like, yeah, this seems pretty legit. I like these new ideas. I'm sure many of them were pretty happy that they didn't have to pay a 10% tax or tithe to the church anymore. That might have been something that drew some of them. And so all sorts of new ideas of Protestant begin to spread as other reformers kind of start their own Christian Protestant churches. And these are just a giant list of all these different Protestant religions. There are many, many, many more today. And I do not expect you to memorize these. I'd like you to know Lutherans, and we're going to talk about Anglicans and Calvinists. Those are the three I'd like you to be able to remember. We'll also talk about Puritans, but you can see you have Lutherans, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Episcopals, Puritan Congregationals, Baptists. Baptists believed that you really shouldn't start baptism until later in your life. Quakers, Anabaptists, the Mennonites, the Amish, all of these different religious groups form out of this initial Protestant Reformation. All of this is created because Martin Luther nails arguments against the sale of indulgences to the Wittenberg church door. So this is a huge effect, a huge impact that will significantly affect all of Europe. And so what you eventually have is this map of Europe, where before this would be all Roman Catholic. You can see now there are edifices of different religions, different types of Christianity throughout Europe. So you have Anglicans here in England. Obviously, that's where they get their name. Calvinist and Calvinist influences in some parts of France, specifically along trade routes where the cities were. And in the north here, you have obviously our old one from the Great Schism of 1054. You have Eastern Orthodoxy. You have Lutheranism, this orange color. I don't know why it's so much more orange on this map. These are all the areas that really embraced Lutheranism. And then yellow remains Roman Catholic. So Italy stays Roman Catholic. Spain, Portugal, hardcore Roman Catholic. Ireland, Roman Catholic, except for the English colonies there. And France is going to be a bit of a tussle, so we'll talk about them in a second. But France, more or less, majorly as the majority, stays Roman Catholic. But the spread of this Protestant fervor or religious intensity leads to multiple religious divisions in Europe, setting the stage for conflict. Because you have to remember, one of the challenges of these monotheistic religions, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, is like you as a believer of one of these religions believe you are right, and if you are right, everyone else is wrong. And that is not necessarily good, because in a conflict stage, if you are right and everyone else is wrong, well, you need to fight the people who are wrong, right? You don't have to, but these people believed they did. And this leads to incredible religious violence. This is a painting of the St. Bartholomew Day massacre in France. And you can see just the massacring of Protestants by Catholic majority people, dragging people away, hanging people, executing people, beating people in the street. Just incredible persecution of religion. And of course, today, by today's standards, we'd say persecuting a group of people for their religion is wrong. We would today call it a violation of human rights. Back then, they didn't really see it that way. They're like, nope, we're right. God likes us. The other side is wrong. God doesn't like them. They're the wrong type of Christian. And so very violent activities. So to be more specific, to give greater depth and detail, right? That's a main idea of the enduring issues, is try to create lots of specificity. You have several major conflicts break out. And this is across Europe, but we're going to hit some of the big ones. One of these are the French Wars of Religion from 1562 to 1598. So nearly 36 years of, quote, civil war. All right, I want to be very clear here. This is war within France. French people fighting other French people, a civil war, war within a nation between the French Protestants who were called Huguenots. I would like you to star that. In documents, they do not have to translate that Huguenots are Protestants. You need to know that a Huguenot is a French Protestant. And the Catholic monarchy, the French kings stayed Catholic, as did many of the nobles. Not all of them, but many of the nobles. And this war rages on. Again, that St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, when the Queen of France orders this massive persecution and kind of crackdown on the Huguenots, on the French Protestants. In the space of 6 months, they killed nearly 12,000 French Huguenots, and many others fled France, fleeing this religious persecution. They went to more Protestant areas. Specifically, they went to England, or they went to the Germanic lands, the Netherlands, and places like that. And these wars are only ended when a new guy named Henry IV of Navarre, he is in line for the throne, but he is a Protestant. And he basically wins these wars and gains control over most of France. But he realizes, as a Protestant, like the wars will just keep continuing because he won't be acknowledged as the rightful ruler. So he decides to convert back to Catholicism. And he, famously says, Paris is worth a mass. Paris, the capital of France, is worth becoming baptized as a Catholic again. But he doesn't forget his Protestant roots. And so when he becomes King Henry IV of France, he issues a very famous law, the Edict of Nantes. And what this law said is Huguenots, or French Protestants, have the right to live and worship as they want in France. So he converts to Catholicism, but he basically issues a get out of jail free card to his former followers, the Huguenots. And what this leads to is almost 100 years of relative peace in France. But this becomes important because later on, another French king is going to reject this law, leading to more persecution. And even though he issues this law, you still do see some persecution, some violence against the Huguenots. And so a lot of them begin to leave and emigrate, right? They migrate to other places. But you have to remember, a lot of the Protestants were middle and upper class people. People who could read and write were more likely to convert to Protestantism. And when they leave France, they bring their wealth and their knowledge, their skills, whether it's a doctor, whether it's skills in metallurgy, whether it's skills in science or chemistry or whatever, and they bring those to more Protestant friendly countries, specifically the Germanic lands, because there's no real Germany yet, there's the Germanic lands, and England. And this has been argued by historians back and forth. But what you see is basically some wealth trickle out of France. They're still pretty wealthy, but money trickles out. And so does skill and like knowledge. Like if you get rid of all of your middle class, that really damages a country's economy. And so we do see some problems here develop in France that will last for quite some time. Even more terrifying and brutal than the French religious wars, or the wars of religion in France, was the 30 Years' War in Germany. And if you remember that map, a lot of Germany became Protestant and Lutheran, but the Holy Roman Emperor did not, and he kind of controlled huge portions of Germany. And while some German princes did support the Reformation, others did not. And so the church and France and all these other powers started having these huge wars. It began as a conflict between the Protestants and the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor, and it just spiraled into wars over power and over land and over control and over all this stuff. And it was a devastating war. 30 years of warfare led to nearly 8 million deaths. Because not just the war, but you also, when you have war, you had famine and disease and refugee crisis and all these problems. And this war really degenerates into extreme violence, not just fighting of soldiers against soldiers, but because it's a religious war, because people believed that the people they were fighting were sinners and damned to go to hell, they didn't spare civilian populations. And this is a very famous series of woodblock prints. So people carved images into a metal plate and then or into wood, and then they were able to, and sometimes metal too, and were able to create copies of this. These are plates that were created by one of the soldiers in these wars, and he's showing like they would just round up whole villages of people and hang them and kill them and massacre civilians. They would raid farms, violate the women, steal all the food, burn down crops, burn down granaries, burn down farms. It was atrocious. War crimes were committed by both sides. And this war was also very dark because a lot of the fighting was done by mercenaries. Yes, there were knights and lords and actual like armies, but a lot of this fighting was done by paid soldiers. And paid soldiers don't really have any loyalty except for to money. And so they were more likely to sack cities, more likely to violate and be vicious to peasants and farmers and townspeople. You had entire German towns wiped out. And this war was so devastating to the lands of Germany, it took 100 years for Germany's population to recover from the devastation of this conflict. Several peace treaties were ultimately responsible for ending these violent wars. And one of the most famous of these is the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. This ended the conflict between the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and the Lutheran princes. So this ends the conflict in Germany it ends conflict overall between Catholicism and between these Protestant Lutherans. And it has a very famous clause in this peace treaty saying, Cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion. So what this meant is that the people of a land are expected to have the same faith as the ruler. So if you are a Protestant prince, you can enforce Protestantism in your country. If you are a Catholic king, you can enforce Catholicism in your country. That the religion of the king determined the religion of the kingdom. And this kind of becomes the mainstay of religious law and of international law all the way up until about 1750s, 1800, a time period we're going to talk about next year. The second major peace treaty was the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. And in this one, it ends the 30 Years' War, and it basically set the boundaries for like the countries of Europe. And it had several main ideas that we still see in international law today. One is the idea of national sovereignty, that each country or nation has sovereignty or power over its own territory and domestic and internal affairs, and that each country is equal under international law. So even though France might be bigger than, say, Saxony, they're both equals when it comes to negotiating treaties, when it comes to international law, and having their borders and boundaries be respected. Still a main idea of international law today, the idea of national sovereignty. So it's an issue that has endured. It also sets what was called a balance for powers, that they tried to draw the borders of countries in Europe over again to say that no one state or country would be allowed to be strong enough to dominate all others. And if one does get too powerful, other countries should ally against the powerful one to like knock him down a peg. But this Cuius Rio, Ius Religio, that's going to be a big idea we're going to see throughout this year and even leading into next year as well. Other effects of this religious conflict. Well, these are all significant impacts, or you could say this is how the Protestant Reformation through these religious wars was significant and impacted the lives of people. It devastated the land. Like I said, crops were burned down. There was destruction of canal systems, destruction of irrigation systems, poisoning of wells, just really, really brutal types of warfare to not just attack soldiers, but to attack people. It depopulated towns and even wiped out some villages and farms. Thousands were slaughtered. 1/3 of all of Germany's population died either from famine, from disease, or from just being killed viciously and violently. It was total war. You're not just killing to take land, but you're killing to straight up kill the other people because they don't believe the same thing you believe. And it was done by both sides. Catholics killed Protestants, Protestants killed Catholics. That's war atrocities, right? Crimes against humanity, we would call them today. Another impact is it allowed people to break feudal bonds. Different lords with different religions refuse to obey their monarchs. If you decide to become a Protestant and the king is Catholic, you're like, well, we don't believe the same thing. I'm rejecting my feudal obligations to you, and I will fight against you. This is really the cause of the French Wars of Religion and the cause of the 30 Years' War in Germany. A big one: military technology advances radically. These wars kind of start to see the end of knights. Like the idea of a knight in shining armor. I mean, there's still armor being worn all the way into even the Napoleonic Wars with like metal breastplates. But this is a series of wars where we see guns really start to dominate the fighting in Europe. More and more armies are building gun-toting armies. They also start using pikes or long spears, cannons to bash down city walls and bash down castles, and a new style of fort. There's actually a very famous book written about this by an esteemed historian named Geoffrey Parker. He calls this the military revolution. That the transfer of like swords and spears and axes and shields and knights to gun-toting forms of soldiers, of mostly infantry, mostly people mounted on foot, now is the mainstay of fighting, using early types of guns called arquebus or harquebus. They're both correct, they're slightly different. Pikes and cannons. This now is the mainstay of fighting in Europe. This also leads to, part of this military revolution, the creation of standing armies. Basically, after these wars where a lot of the mercenaries were doing the fighting, people realized like mercenaries aren't great. Like they'll go to whoever pays them more money, or sometimes they just won't fight because they don't care about their cause. They're just fighting for a paycheck. And so more and more European kings and princes begin to build standing armies, national armies, loyal to the monarch, who are paid with tax money. Instead of paying mercenaries to do your fighting, raise your own army for your own country. And instead of relying on nobles, which now can break their feudal bonds, hire your own army, build forts for them, equip them with guns and pikes and stuff like that. And that will be your army. And that is still what we have today, right? All countries today have a standing army. That comes out of these wars of religion. Another negative effect of these religious conflicts: witch hunts on both sides, but we have a massive increase in this idea of sin and corruption and people making deals with the devil and making deals with demons. And you have thousands of people burned at the stake for being witches. And a lot of these people, unfortunately, were women. Women who challenged authority, women who got too mouthy, women who were just old. Like, oh, that woman's old. She must be a witch. She has a cat. Well, we all have cats because rats eat our food and rats carry the plague. Yeah, but she's old and she has a cat, so she's a witch. Let's burn her. And you also saw an increase in anti-Semitism, or violence and hatred of Jews, because as the Europeans were like, well, as long as we're killing people that don't believe in the same religion as us, let's kill these Jewish populations as well. And you see just brutal violence against Jewish people again. And a lot of these Jews then flee into Eastern Europe, which wasn't having this Protestant Reformation, because they were mostly Eastern Orthodox. And they bring their knowledge and their skills and their money with them. And here's a picture of these mercenaries, these Landsknechts, were the main participants in these religious wars, and their violence, their rapacity, their viciousness was legendary. It's a German word that literally means land knight, the Landsknechts. We got this great quote: Duke Alva to King Philip II of Spain on the sack of a Dutch city: no nail was left in the wall. They literally ripped down the entire city, nail by nail, timber by timber, brick by brick. So that's what's going on in large portions of Western Europe. Now we're going to take a look at other forms of this Protestant Reformation and their impacts on other specific countries. One of the most famous of these is the Reformation's impact on the Kingdom of England. England will also choose to break away from the Roman Catholic Church and form their own type of Reformation, their own type of Christianity. And this all starts with the King of England, King Henry VIII. And he's a big deal. We're going to star him. He's got some big stuff going on. He also was like literally just a big guy. And early on in his life, he was just tall and jacked, like a NFL linebacker. And then he just kept eating and drinking and eating and drinking until he weighed like 380 pounds or something by the time of his death. Now, he began life as a Catholic, as well, like everyone in Europe did before the Reformation. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, also was Catholic, but she couldn't give him a male heir. She kept popping out girl children, and he wants to have a son. He wants to have someone to take the throne on. So he tries to have his marriage annulled. You can't get divorced in the Catholic Church. So he tries to annul his marriage. He gets the Pope. He's like, hey, Popey, I'm a Catholic. You're a Catholic, pretty Catholic. Could you say that my marriage never really happened to Catherine of Aragon? And the Pope said no. And there's a lot of different reasons. The Pope was strongly allied to the Spanish monarchy, who Catherine of Aragon was a Spanish princess. And so he's like, yeah, that's not going to be a good power move for me. So no, you cannot annul this marriage. Catherine of Aragon is your wife. And so Henry's like, okay, I see what you did there. I see that. I got you. I'm going to do some maneuvers and I'm going to see what I can come up with. So he calls together a special parliament. Now, in 1529, the Protestant Reformation has been going on for almost a decade or two, since 1517. And so this Reformation, he staffs it with a bunch of people he knows are sympathetic to Protestantism. He staffs this parliament with people he knows want to reform the church in England. And so they end the Pope's authority. They say, yep, we will no longer acknowledge the authority of the Pope. And that allows him to divorce Catherine of Aragon. She's out of the picture, and he gets to marry someone new. And she also doesn't produce him a male heir. So he goes on to keep marrying women, eventually having 6 different wives before one is finally able to give him a male heir. A couple years later, he has another parliament come together. In 1534, he calls parliament the lawmaking or legislative body in England, and he has them pass a law, the Act of Supremacy. What this did is create a new Church of England, a Anglican church, right? That's where we get the name England, Anglican, Isle of Angels. And he says, this is a new church. It's a Protestant church. We are not going to obey the Pope. We are not going to obey all the rules and laws of former Catholicism. We're going to reform the church. And what he did this for is because he gets to be head of this Anglican church. And therefore, he uses it as an opportunity to seize church land, specifically monasteries and like the excess land owned by the church. That had been 20% of England's land. So the king, through this act of supremacy, through becoming head of the church, he instantly seizes control over 20% of England's land. And you're like, well, Mr. Campbell, he's the king. Doesn't he own all the land? No, the church owned a lot of the land too, and a king can't tax or control or do anything with church land. But suddenly, as head of this new Protestant Church of England or Anglican Church, he can do whatever he wants because he's the head of the church. And so during his reign, he surrounds himself with Protestant reformers, Protestant leaders, and he begins to implement other Protestant ideas. And Protestantism spreads to many different people in England, absorbing this new Anglican Protestant faith. Unfortunately, when he dies, when Henry VIII passes away, England experiences its own religious turmoil and violence. Not quite as brutal as the wars of religion in France and as the 30 Years' War in Germany, but it's still not great. His son, Edward VI, over here, he was kind of like a sickly dude. And so he died very early on. He only ruled for 6 years. So though he's a Protestant and he continues these Protestant changes, he doesn't live past 15 years of age and he dies. And so the throne passes to Queen Mary. This is Catherine of Aragon's daughter, right? She had daughters with Henry VIII. And like her mom, she had remained a Catholic. And so she tries to go right back to Catholicism. As queen, she's like, nope, Protestants are heretics, Church of England is wrong, and she gets the nickname Bloody Mary for arranging these burnings of Protestants, for arranging these mass executions of Protestants. And so England doesn't really like her very much. She dies, and then the next one in line for the throne is Elizabeth I. Star her, she's kind of a big deal, both historically and today. She comes to the throne in 1558, and she restores Anglican Protestantism. She says, yep, that is the only legal religion of England. We are Protestants. We are a Protestant nation now and forever. And she provides political and religious stability because she rules for a very, very long time. So let's look at Elizabeth I of England, the Virgin Queen. She returns religious stability to England by saying we're a Protestant nation and we're not going to go back to Catholicism and, ending obviously the execution of Protestants. She establishes colonies in the New World, which bring wealth and power to England. She implements the Northern Renaissance. These Renaissance ideas finally have made their way to England, and she is a patron of the arts, a patron of paintings, a patron of theater. It's during her reign and her rule in England that Shakespeare gets his kick and begins the Globe Theater, creating all these works, right? Shakespeare, you have Romeo and Juliet, you have oh my God, my mind is blanking on other ones. You have The Taming of the Shrew and all these other famous plays welcoming in these Northern Renaissance ideas. And she also is known as the Virgin Queen because she refused to marry. She realized that if she married, even though she was English and she was the queen, once she marries, whoever she marries is the king now. And he gets to dictate policy in England. So she still wanted to be in power, so she just says, well, I'm not going to marry. But she used the prospect of marriage as a political tool. She'd be like, hey, you want to hang out? Maybe we could get married. And this would bring nobles to her side. She held out the prospect of marriage to King Philip II of Spain, who was a Catholic. She's like, we can marry. Maybe Catholicism's not so bad. And was able to get things she wanted out of him until he realized she was just stringing him along. And she also created a cult of personality around herself. Both this idea that as a virgin, she was more holy like a nun, and that gave her purity of mind and spirit to rule over England. She had tons and tons of paintings made for her, and people loved her. People thought she was awesome. There obviously are some people in England wow, why are we taking orders from a woman? But she was powerful. She brought wealth. She brought Renaissance ideas. She brought grandeur into England, and she helped keep England strong. And so that's why she's acknowledged really as one of England's greatest rulers. And pretty amazing because in a time period where most of the world was patriarchal, including England, she is this powerful, dominant female leader. One of her most famous actions, even though the part she personally played in it is a little questionable, was the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Spain, a Catholic country, wanted to punish England for supporting Protestants. And so their king, Philip II, who was also super butthurt about not becoming the king of Spain by marrying her, he uses money from silver from the New World. We will get into the discovery of the New World in a later unit, but tons of silver, tons of money is flowing into Spain, and he uses this money to build a massive war fleet and army known as the Spanish Armada. And his plan is using this massive war fleet, using this massive army, he's going to invade Spain, return it to the Catholic Church, return the Pope's authority to control, and declare himself king of England and Spain. And he's unsuccessful. You had very brilliant English naval commanders. Sir Francis Drake is kind of one of the most famous, even though, he's knighted, but he also was a pirate. It's kind of an interesting dude. He realizes his ships are not as strong and powerful as the Spanish ships, but they are more maneuverable. And so he uses this greatest maneuverability and their knowledge of the waters around England, as well as this tactic called fire ships, literally building rafts and loading them with burning wood and just sailing them towards the enemy fleet. And again, you can't really turn on a dime with these giant wooden ships. And so you're just hoping they don't hit you. And if they hit you, well, your ship lights on fire. It's not really good. And on top of that, so Sir Francis Drake delivers a defeat using these fire ships, using these tactics against the Spanish Armada. And then, while the Spanish Armada tries to recover and sail to a different point to invade England, you have this massive storm rise up. The Protestants, the people of England, called this the Great Protestant Wind, and this sea storm devastated the Spanish fleet. They sunk 130 ships, nearly 30,000 trained sailors and soldiers died. And so this is impact of geography. England, as an island nation, is protected from this invasion. It's very hard to invade a country via water. The chances of an invasion through water going wrong are very, very high because, again, nature, like a fierce storm, like your enemy knowing the waters better than you. We saw the same thing in the Persian Wars, where the Greeks defeat the Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis because they have faster, more maneuverable ships, and they know the waters better, and they know when storms are coming because they can kind of read the ocean a little bit better. And so Spain arguably never really recovers from the defeat of the Spanish Armada. They sank so much money into this fleet, and they had so many of their soldiers that were trained and brilliant commanders die, that Spain is kind of a weaker European power from the 1600s on. So huge impact of geography here. Another way to show impact of religion, this war between Spain and England. Lots of juicy tidbits in here. And here's just a map. You have this attack by the Spanish. They're leaving here. They invade. You have this defeat here, a defeat here. They try to sail around England, and the storms just smash them and sink the fleet off of Scapa Flow. So what does the Catholic Church do? They've got, people rebelling against the Pope's authority across Europe. What is the church to do? How are they going to stop this? They want to be the sole Christian religion in Europe. They believe they are. They believe they're the only people that have the key to salvation in heaven. So what they do is begin the Counter-Reformation, sometimes called the Catholic Reformation. They begin to initiate a series of reforms to try to stop the spread of Protestantism and to strengthen the Catholic Church. So this is what the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation is. They got a new pope, Pope Paul III, and one of the things he does that's not really good is he reconvenes or brings back the Roman Inquisition, these courts of faith. Now, we talked about these a little bit in the Middle Ages. These guys are pretty awful. They are super violent. They are super terrifying, and they are basically courts. And they can take soldiers. They can arrest people. They can do whatever they want. Their goal is to root out heresy or wrong belief, and they believe Protestantism or Protestant belief, Lutheranism, Huguenots, whoever they are, that is wrong belief. And they often use brutal means, specifically torture of arrested people to get confessions, and torture to be like, all right, well, who else is a Protestant? And under torture, you'll say anything. So you'll just start listing names of people you know rather than have them, rip out more fingernails or take a hammer to your other foot after they've broken your one foot. And so this led to devastating violence against people, some of whom weren't even, Protestants. And even so, even if they are Protestants, again, that's religious persecution. And these are all actual paintings or woodblock prints of tortures used by the Inquisition. You have these Inquisition cardinals and bishops overseeing the torture, hanging person till their arms and legs dislocate, burning those guilty alive to save them from the fires of hell, sometimes violence towards women, sometimes just public denunciations where they'd have these Protestants wear these, we call them dunce caps, but these hats labeling them as heretics, and people would just yell at them and scream at them, torturing people on the wheel, burning Protestant books that they found, all sorts of disgusting, burning people's feet, just really horrific, nightmare stuff, all in the name of God. They did this in the name of God and Jesus. So doesn't seem very Christ-like to me, but they thought they were doing the right thing. One of the other elements coming out of the Counter-Reformation was the creation of a new monastic order known as the Jesuits. The Jesuits were founded by a Catholic priest and monk named Ignatius Loyola, And he is a very educated individual. And he's like, yeah, let's not like torture people. Instead of killing and torturing and wiping out our enemies, we should come up with arguments against Protestantism. Like, I believe we're right, that the church is good. We should spread the Catholic faith. We should remind people why Catholicism is good. And then we should work actively to spread Catholicism to other countries, other new lands. And so this becomes a huge missionary order. These monks would travel across the world. They travel to Africa, Asia. It is Jesuits who convert people in China. It is Jesuits who convert people in Japan. Those are Jesuit monks who converted the early Japanese Christians, who then, were killed by the Tokugawa. And they also were responsible for missionary action in the Americas when Spain discovers the Americas. It's the Jesuits who go there to convert the Native Americans, the Amerindians, to Catholicism. They're also responsible for translating other people's languages. It was Jesuits who were the first to translate Chinese and Japanese and a variety of other languages, and create, basically books of translation so other people could learn these languages. And they did this to better convert people, but the impact is now, like, Europeans can read if they want to and learn other languages. They can set up trade relationships. They can do a lot of other stuff. The Jesuits built schools and universities. Again, Ignatius Loyola believed that education was important. You had to educate people on why Catholicism was better. Boston College is an example of a Jesuit organization. And they worked to stop the spread of Protestantism. And some of the areas they had a lot of success in: Poland remained Catholic. That's a country in Europe, as well as southern Germany, which would eventually become Austria. They are also successful there. Where northern Germany embraces Protestantism, southern Germany kind of doesn't. So Ignatius Loyola is a huge, impactful figure in the Catholic Church. And then one of the other penultimate elements of this Counter-Reformation was the Council of Trent. This isn't one council, it's a series of councils held in the Italian city of Trent between 1545 and 1563. And the goal here is, let's invite the Pope, let's invite cardinals, bishops, and powerful and knowledgeable priests. Let's sit down and let's debate. What are the problems in Christianity? What are the problems in the Catholic Church? And what should we change? And the end result is, they decide like they're perfect and they don't need to change anything. It's not perfectly true, but like, yeah, they're basically like, no, we're right in everything. They say, no, the church's interpretation of the Bible is final. Like, the church does get to interpret the Bible. You should not only read the Bible and make your own decisions. They say that the Bible is important, but it combines with the church's traditions, with the church's rituals, and they're equal in authority. So the Pope is equal to the Bible, which again, this is why the Protestants were like, no, we're just going to read the Bible. They did say indulgences were valid, but they said you can't sell them anymore. So that is like one small thing they acknowledge. But there are still indulgences in the Catholic Church today. A couple years ago, Pope Francis I, he offered indulgences for following the Pope on Twitter. You follow the Pope on Twitter, you get an indulgence. Some of your sins are taken away. Some of your time in purgatory is taken away. But you can't sell them anymore. And that has continued to this day. You can't sell them. But you can donate millions of dollars to Catholic charities and possibly get an indulgence that way. So, question mark. And the other thing he did that's super bad, at least in historical opinion, he creates the Index, a list of banned books and writings. So now the church is going to very strictly censor what can and cannot be published and read in Catholic countries. So any of the kings, like the King of France, the King of Spain, the King of Portugal, who remained Catholic, they're going to have these lists of books that cannot be read. And if you are found with these books, they might call in the Inquisition. Famously, you might have heard of a guy named Galileo. He writes books kind of arguing that the earth revolves around the sun. Those become banned. They get put on the Index as wrong belief because they go against the teachings of the church that the earth is the center of the universe. And so this Index lasts for a long time of these banned books that you could be arrested and possibly tortured or imprisoned for having. So this is a little cheat sheet, the Reformation summary. Because it is very difficult to write with this fun little pen I have. This is something we're going to fill out together in class. You can use your notes to do so, but we have long-term causes, short-term causes of the Reformation, long-term effects, short-term effects of the Reformation. So if we look at long-term causes, blank became more worldly and corrupt. We would say the church or the Catholic Church or leaders of the church became more worldly, obsessed with wealth and power, and corrupt. Blank wanted to return to a simpler religion. Some Christians wanted to return to a simpler form of Christianity. Strong blank emerged and resented the power of the church. Strong kings, leaders, or princes emerged and resented the power of the church. Short-term causes. Indulgences were sold in Europe. Martin Luther writes the 95 Theses against them. Martin Luther translates the Bible into German or the vernacular. The printing press helps spread ideas across Europe, and reformers call for change or for new types of Christianity. Short-term effects, peasants' revolt, and princes' revolt as well against the power of the Roman Catholic Church. Many different Protestant churches are founded, and the power of the Holy Roman Empire is weakened because it's not everyone's Roman Catholic anymore. Long-term effects, loss of religious unity in Western Europe. Religious wars broke out for more than 100 years. Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation was begun. And anti-Semitism increases, causing many Jews to flee to Eastern Europe. And these are some of the effects and causes of the Protestant Reformation. Thank you for joining me and have a great day.